Let's talk about Snap and diversity in their workforce, because Evan Spiegel, the CEO there, making some headlines after he reportedly told workers or his employees at an all-company meeting that he doesn't want to release the diversity numbers. This comes, of course, more than a week after he sent out a really heartfelt note talking about the need to address the issue of income inequality as well as diversity. I want to bring in Brian Cheung for this conversation. So Brian, Evan Spiegel's argument seems to be that he doesn't want to release these numbers because he doesn't want to be sort of put in the same category, so to speak, as other Silicon Valley companies who've been criticized for the lack of diversity there. But a lot of these companies have reported those numbers already.
Well, Akiko, a bit of a mix-up PR-wise for Snap and for CEO Evan Spiegel. As you mentioned, he was telling employees apparently that he doesn't want to publicly release the diversity figures because he worries that it'll reinforce the perception of Silicon Valley as being predominantly white and male. Now, that seems to overlook the purpose of unveiling or publicly disclosing your diversity numbers to show that you're taking initiative and to show the progress that you're making if you're trying to overcome that perception. Now, Evan Spiegel doubled down on that comment and on CNBC yesterday. He said in an interview, he worries that all these disclosures, quote, have actually normalized the current composition of the tech workforce. So it sounds like from Evan Spiegel's perspective, he doesn't want to release the numbers because he worries that releasing those numbers would actually get other Silicon Valley companies to say, well, if this is the standard, I guess this is how every other company should be. So a little bit of kind of crossed messages here from the Snap CEO, but he does appear to acknowledge that the company itself does have some legwork to go. And I do want to make that delineation. It's not necessarily that him not releasing those diversity numbers means that Snap doesn't want to do anything about it. He just doesn't feel that releasing the numbers in and of itself would do much for the company's initiatives. But regardless, it does acknowledge what is an inherent truth within the Silicon Valley industry at large, which is that diversity does remain an issue.
Yeah, and to that point, back in 2014, a lot of these big tech firms committed to releasing a diversity report every year. And some interesting numbers here, because CNBC recently did an analysis of where they've actually moved since they committed to improving diversity. And the numbers certainly don't look promising. Yes, things have gotten better, but we're talking about single-digit growth in terms of the number of minorities that are being hired into these companies. And Facebook specifically showed the smallest increase in their Black workforce, going from 3% to 3.8% in the last 5 years. And Brian, we've talked over the last few weeks about a lot of these companies who are coming out with these great statements, making these commitments. But do you think those numbers speak to the fact that there needs to be some kind of measure or some kind of consequence on the other end to push companies to make the change more quickly?
Well, as you mentioned, there is a divide between what the companies are actually doing on the diversity front and what their PR or even advertising teams are doing with regards to some of these big number donations. Keep in mind, you have Apple and YouTube each committing recently to donate up to $100 million each. Apple on criminal justice reform, and then Google's YouTube on trying to increase the amount of voices of Black creators and artists. But within the companies themselves, as you mentioned, a lot of progress to be done about actually getting the employees to be more representative of the actual composition of the United States, as opposed to being predominantly white and male. And when you mention those disclosures, those are not things that are federally required. These are things that the companies have the opportunity to release themselves, which is why Snap is deciding that they don't want to do that right now. But when you talk about transparency, this is an issue that even investors have started to care increasingly about over time. When you consider the rise of ESG investing, investors are paying attention to whether or not these companies are making good faith efforts to try to increase the diversity, because as we know, there are monetary benefits to this as well. Companies that have more diversity are shown to perform better than other companies that do not. So when we talk about especially big tech, especially because they're such a big driver in our US corporate culture, that's going to be a question as we go forward. But again, as you mentioned, it's not single-handedly an issue of what's their PR in response to the Black Lives Matter protests nationwide, but what are these companies doing in the long run to change their corporate culture through the types of people and the faces of the people that work there?
Yeah, that's going to be the real measure of how committed they are actually to diversity. It'll be interesting to see where these numbers go over the next year or so.